Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Craig Symonds. Craig is the Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the US Naval War College and the Professor Emeritus at the US Naval Academy. Today, what I thought we'd investigate is the interwar naval treaties which aim to prevent conflict. But at the same time, what they did was help shape the navies of the world in the build-up to the Second World War. But just before we kick off, it's a big thank you to all those patrons of the show. The $1 or so each month they provide helps me find the time to put the show together for all our enjoyment. I already know I have a bit more of Craig and I chatting, which I will make exclusively available to patrons. So if you're interested in becoming a patron of the podcast, helping to keep the show on the road, you can find the details at patreon.com/WW2podcast or go to the website www2podcast.com and click on donate. Right, on to the main feature. Craig, thanks for joining me. Whilst the outbreak of World War I was very much exacerbated by the naval rivalry, and certainly Britain entered into the naval arms race with Germany, which was very public, with the "We want aid and we won't wait" as the sort of newspaper slogan. Post-war and in those interwar years, the world seems to want to avoid such an arms race and tried to set limits. The first of these agreements was the Washington Naval Conference in 1922. Why was it felt that naval power needed to be regulated?
There was a wide perception on both sides of the Atlantic that the battleship rivalry between Britain and Germany in the run-up to World War I, that is from roughly 1905 to 1914, from the launching of the Dreadnought to the outbreak of war, that naval competition had, if not necessarily caused the war, had contributed to the distrust that fed the rivalry between Britain and Germany. So the idea after the war was well, there were two ideas. The first one was, let's not do that again. Let's not create a circumstance where two great powers find themselves increasingly antagonistic with one another because each is trying to become the top naval power in the region. So there is that. We're not going to repeat the errors of the past. That's part of it. But the other part of it is that during the First World War, when the United States became a belligerent, it enacted a building program just prior to its declaration of war to construct a large number of battleships and battle cruisers and heavy cruisers. And then when the United States got into the war in 1917, the United States discovered that the real need on the Allied side was not for more battleships. The British actually had plenty of those, thank you very much. What they really needed were more convoy escorts. So the construction of all those battleships put on hold in the United States to build escorts. And then, when the war ended, just by default, the battleship construction program continued. Well, that made absolutely no sense. Once war was over in 1918, 1919, after Versailles, why was the United States building battleships, very expensive battleships, when the only possible rival could have been Britain? An Anglo-American naval rivalry simply made no sense. So not only to prevent the mistakes of 1905 to 1914, but to cut off this absurd Anglo-American naval arms race, which would serve no one's interest, the United States invited all the great powers, a dozen great powers, all to come to Washington to talk about, isn't there a way we can stop this and cut this short? That was the two twinned motives for the Washington Conference that began in 1921 and ended with the treaty that was signed in 1922.
So, I mean, the outcome of this is the 552 formula, which limits the number of battleships. So how did this work?
Well, the formula was actually 553. Not that I want to correct your math. But, what actually began in a very interesting way. The very first day of the conference, All the great powers met in the Great Hall, and everyone assumed this would be a day filled with welcoming speeches and a lot of hot air and not much actual progress. But when the American Secretary of State took the floor for his welcoming address, he had a very specific program that he outlined. And what he said was, we have X number of battleships under construction. We are willing to scrap all of them, and we will scrap other ships that already exist. Well, this was such a stunning remark. Here he had laid all his cards on the table on the very first day, but he wasn't done yet. He then went on to explain, and Great Britain will scrap the following ships, and listed them by name, and then the Japanese and the Italians and the French, and on he went. And while there were adjustments to that subsequently, the general terms that he outlined on that very first day became the heart of the eventual agreement. And the formula that emerged from that became popularized as 553, was actually based on the total battleship tonnage, not total naval tonnage, but just battleships, since the perception was that battleships were offensive weapons, and if you could limit those, you limited the risk of another war. So the total tonnage was 525,000 total tons for both the United States and Great Britain, co-equal. The great sacrifice Britain made there was that it accepted the idea that it would not be the strongest power in the world, but it would be tied co-equal with one other power, even though it was a power that was clearly an ally at the time. So both Britain and France would have 525,000 tons, and the Japanese would have 335,000 tons, which was roughly a ratio of 553, and then the French and the Italians each accepted a lower number of 1.75. So that number represented the ratio of the battleship tonnage allowed to each of the five great powers.
Reaching back 20-some years, I have a feeling even at school I was taught that the British had come out of this rather badly, having the largest and oldest fleet, leaving others with more modern ships. Is that the case?
I think the British certainly felt that way. I think they felt it was an enormous sacrifice. The question for 100 years and more had been, in terms of British naval power ratio with other powers, whether it must have a navy larger than all the other powers combined, or only larger than the next two powers combined, or twice as large as the next strongest. So these were the kinds of ratios and formulas that British naval planners have been dealing with for as long as any of them have been alive. And now here's a ratio where it's the same as another power, and Britain was not used to that. In addition to which, it did actually have to take some existing warships and agree to make them operational. So that was painful for the Royal Navy. So I think the perception very strongly was that they had gotten the short end of the stick here. But in fact, given the economic situation that existed in 1922 in the United States and Great Britain, it would have been far easier for the United States to complete that naval building program on the books and make the United States the sole great naval power on Earth. It would have been a tremendous strain for Britain in the wake of the First World War, having strained every sinew already to win that war, to keep up with the United States. So although it looked like Britain was surrendering its scepter as mistress of the seas, in fact, in terms of the economic circumstances, it was about the best deal the British could have expected.
So as the 20s wear on, why is there a feeling then that yet more limitations are needed? Is that down to cost again? Well, because they have the next conferences in London in 1930. Is that purely economic?
It's largely economic. The follow-on conference, the first treaty is signed in 1922, and usually called the Washington Treaty. Then in 1930, all the great powers met in London to do a follow-on, and the goals in London were to extend the 553 ratio of battleships, but also to apply either that ratio or some slightly modified ratio to other combatants as well, to include cruisers, destroyers. There was a lot of conversation about submarines. Should submarines be banned entirely? So part of it was to extend the perceived success of the 1922 treaty, but also remember 1930 is in the immediate wake of the stock market crash in the United States, the effects of which were rippling all over the globe, so that nations were running out of money to pay for very expensive naval ships. And this naval ships about the most expensive thing in the early 20th century in a nation's defense program. So if you could limit those, you could save some money. So the economy was certainly one of the motives.
Were these difficult negotiations? Because it strikes me that to any nation, its navy is a sort of a complex web of national pride, how much you can afford, and a projection of national power. So you get certainly like Britain there. It's a strange triangle to try and join up.
Right, pride is very much a part of every nation's planning. You have to sell whatever agreement you make to your own public, especially in a democracy. But in addition to that, Britain's argument could be based on the fact that they had vital national interests in more areas than the United States did. The United States was interested in the Atlantic and the Pacific, two great coasts. I suppose you could make an argument for the Gulf of Mexico. But Britain had interest in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean and the North Sea and the Baltic and so on, so that if the British accept a co-equal status with the United States, they have to spread their fleet thinner around the globe. And in addition to that, another difference is that the British want more but smaller cruisers, what are called light cruisers, roughly 6,000 tons displacement with 6-inch guns, because you can build more of them for the same amount of money and therefore patrol more of the empire on which quite literally the sun never sets. Whereas the United States, whose interests were in the distant Pacific around the Philippines and so forth, wanted the larger heavy cruisers. Well, how then do you say how many large cruisers are equal to how many small cruisers? There's another ratio that has to be worked out. So all of these differences had to be taken into consideration at London.
But then it's strange then that certain things seem to come off the table. So there's carriers come off the table, yet they're clearly going to be of enormous importance. Well, they probably clearly weren't seen as being enormous importance in 1930, but in another 10 to 12 years' time, they're of enormous importance. Yet they're not part of this agreement.
Right. One of the great things about being an historian is having the benefit of hindsight and knowing that carriers are going to emerge in the Second World War as the dominant platform for naval combat. But in 1930, that was much less clear. In 1930, carriers were very much experimental vessels. The idea was that their function would be largely to scout for the battleships, that they would report the fall of shot, they would find the enemy, report the location of the enemy, and yes, they could launch the occasional airstrike, but not in the kinds of numbers that would emerge in the 1940s during the Second World War. So given how much time, effort, and energy was invested in determining what kind of cruisers and how big they could be and what kind of guns they could have, the amount of attention paid to aircraft carriers was tiny. And in fact, there was an upper limit established, but it was so high that it left lots of room for future experimentation in the development of aircraft carriers. And that's a surprise to an audience today looking back on it, because clearly that was something they ought to have spent more time on.
Yeah, and it's surprising as well, because the Americans I don't know if they'd already completed, but they're already put down two of the well-known aircraft carriers from the Second World War. So they were already thinking ahead with those carriers.
Well, that's mostly an accident, to be honest. I'd like to claim foresight on behalf of the Americans, but I just don't think it's there. What happened was that a number of ships that had been laid down in 1916, as the United States contemplated possible involvement in the First World War, were still in the building yards when the war came to an end in 1919. And the question was, well, what do we do with these giant battle cruiser and battleship platforms? We can't turn them into battleships. We've just made an agreement that we won't do that. So why don't we convert these existing hulls into aircraft carrier hulls? Now, the reason that's important is because aircraft carriers up to that time had been relatively small vessels, displacing 10 to 12,000 tons, carrying perhaps a dozen aircraft. that could act as scouts for the battleships. But now that you've got a battleship hull with this enormous flight deck and capable of carrying between 70 and 90 aircraft, now it's a completely different function. Now it can act as a standalone strike force. Instead of scouting for the battle fleet would scout for it. And it just turned the whole issue right over. But it wasn't so much because foresighted people were saying, I can see into the future, and I can tell that large carriers are going to be the most important ship. It was because when we have these holes, I guess we'll transform them into carriers. Now, what can they do?
Mm. Yeah. The other thing that doesn't seem to really be covered in the agreement is submarines. So there's an upper limit of 2,000 tons. Now, I was looking up the big German resupply U-boats in the war were just under that tonnage. So there's almost a conscious decision to take submarines out of the agreement by setting the limit so high. I mean, who's championing submarines in 1930 to push that limit up?
Angus, that is exactly what happened. The idea of limiting each submarine to being no more than 2,000 tons was to say, well, there's no limit whatsoever, because there was no submarine anywhere near 2,000 tons, certainly not at the time, and even subsequently. Today, of course, there are, but they have an entirely different function. To answer your question directly, the individuals who were arguing for having no limits whatsoever to submarines were the French and the Italians, because the French and the Italians were clearly accepting an open and rather decisive inferiority to the English-speaking allies, as well as to the Japanese. And their view of submarines is that they were a defensive craft that they could use to protect their coasts and protect their harbors, not as an offensive weapon to be used against merchant shipping, but as a defensive weapon to protect themselves from an intrusion by, let's say, British battleships. So they absolutely held their breath and insisted there be no limit whatsoever on submarines. Now, the Americans and the British argued vehemently that submarines should not only be severely limited, they should be banned entirely. Submarines were used, the British pointed out, to sink unarmed merchant ships on the high seas and kill civilians. That's an inhumane weapon of war. They ought to be banned, just like germ warfare and gas warfare. It ought not to be allowed. And the French responded by saying, well, you realize, of course, that airplanes can drop bombs on cities and kill innocent civilians. Shall we ban all airplanes because they can be used inhumanely? It's not the instrument itself that's inhumane, it's the way it's used, which is a somewhat suspect argument. But they were determined, if they were going to accept inferiority in battleships, they were, by golly, going to maintain their ability to defend their coasts by having submarines. And that's where the opposition came from.
I'm quite surprised that the British and the Americans gave in on that, really, because the British certainly had been there'd been such a problem with them during the First World War. I did wonder if they'd sort of couldn't believe that anyone would use them offensively again. And were measuring their opponents like themselves, saying, "Well, we surely wouldn't use it offensively, so we'll give way on this."
No, they weren't naive about that. I think they were aware that the submarines, any nation with submarines would be tempted. In fact, I think this was an argument that was made by Henry Stimson, the American representative at London. Any nation with submarines would be tempted, perhaps tempted irresistibly, to use submarines in the way they had been used in the First World War, that is to sink unarmed merchant ships on the high seas. So they weren't naive about that. But the British did believe, there are two things here. Let me start with the technological one. The British did believe that they had gained a leg up on against submarines with this new breakthrough that they had been working on and was just on the verge of becoming operational, and that was something called ASDIC, which, of course, is what the Americans call sonar. It's an underwater echo-ranging system that allows a surface ship to find and to track a submerged submarine. And the British thought, now that we have this, submarines can no longer sneak up on a ship and fire a torpedo from 300 yards away while submerged. We'll know where they are. we can attack them, we can maneuver to avoid. So the invention of ASDIC will allow us to avoid the worst consequences of submarines. But in addition to that, there was the fact that, remember, the Germans weren't allowed to have submarines at all, according to the Versailles Treaty. They could only have 6 battleships, and they had to be small battleships, and no submarines whatsoever. So the Germans, those who had used U-boats most effectively in the First World War, they were banned from having any submarines at all. So the only ones who would be banned from having submarines, if it were agreed to at London, would be the victorious Allies.
I mean, you mentioned Germany there. Is Germany allowed to attend at all the treaties? But she's certainly overlooked in them because she's under obligation for the Versailles Treaty. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, not only overlooked, but not even invited. The Germans were not even there. The Germans were not in Washington for the 1922 treaty. They were not in London for the 1930 treaty. They were ignored entirely, as were, by the way, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not invited. So, the communists and the Germans were considered pariah nations and were not part of the agreement.
So why does Britain suddenly feel in 1935 it needs to come to its own agreement with Germany? Why does it not have another international conference, this time bringing Germany into the fold?
Well, they did actually agree to have another international conference in 1935, but a number of nations, the Japanese, for example, walked out on it. We don't want to have anything to do with this. If you won't give us parity, by then they were so humiliated by their subordination to the Anglo-Americans, they insisted that they must have parity or they'd walk out, which they did. So the 1935 international agreement crashed and burned, and that never got done. The British instead signed a separate agreement with Germany, and it looks, again in hindsight, like a foolish thing to have done because it lifted many of the restrictions that the Versailles Treaty had imposed on the German Navy, including submarines. Germany was now allowed to have as many submarines, they could have up to a certain percentage of the British in submarines, and in the event of a crisis, not defined, the Germans could build as many submarines as the British had. And that seems, again, foolish. Why would the British unilaterally agree to let the Germans once again build submarines? And there are 2 reasons for this. One I've already mentioned, and that is the ASDIC. They thought, well, submarines won't be as great a threat because we have ASDIC. And the other is the British were becoming very concerned about the growth and power of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Stalin was asserting himself and rattling his weapons, and Germany, British statesmen believe, would be a useful buffer against Soviet ambitions. So building up Germany, allowing Germany once again to regain some of its prior pre-war military strength would act as a balancer against the Soviet Union. That was the idea behind it.
Ultimately, did this treaty mean much for certainly the opening of the Second World War? Because battleships, ships, navies take time to build. They take time to be planning, and everything needs to be put in place. And I wonder, did this treaty actually mean anything for the Second World War? Could Germany turn around its navy in time could it have ever even turned around its navy in time to have been anything of a threat? A big threat to the Royal Navy.
The great contribution of the Naval Arms Limitation Treaties of 1922 and 1930 is that they saved people a lot of money. I don't think they convinced anyone not to go to war. I don't think they changed the character of the war that subsequently came. The Germans, of course, once they were released from their restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, began to build not only battleships, but what we might call super battleships, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, as well as super battle cruisers, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 700 feet long, enormous swift vessels with 15-inch guns. So these were substantial weapons. The irony in that is that Germany invested so much money in these large surface ships, largely at the behest of Erich Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and did not build up the number of submarines that the head of the U-boat arm, Karl Dönitz, believed would have been necessary to defeat Britain in a naval war. And a prima facie case can be made that Dönitz was right. If he had had the 300 U-boats at the beginning of the war that he had been telling Hitler for years would be necessary, it's entirely conceivable that they could have shut down the North Atlantic trade lines entirely and brought Britain to its knees in 1940. And that did not happen because Dunnet simply did not have the number of submarines he needed, in part because the Germans had invested so much money in the construction and development of a large surface navy. Now, eventually the Germans would figure this out. They would demobilize the surface navy, except for the Tirpitz, and invest most of their money in the building of U-boats, but by then it was too late.
Do you think that investment in the surface navy was partly to do with prestige over necessarily practicality, or do you think Raeder just didn't understand what the next war was going to bring?
I think it was entirely prestige. One of the things Hitler wanted, I mean, all the trappings of the Nazi Empire, you know, the parades and the torches and the symbolism and the singing and all this nonsense that they got into, is a manifestation of Hitler's determination to create a perception of German, not only German strength, but German greatness, so that ships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz were symbols almost more than they were actual weapons of war.
I once met one of the pilots who'd bombed the Tirpitz. Met him not long before he died.
I'll be darned. How about that?
I wondered, the 35 Anglo-German treaty, I wonder if it effectively also reduced what Germany could do insofar as it didn't have enough of a bulk of a fleet to ever go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy, which sort of then left them becoming commerce, if not commerce raiders, sounds a bit petty, but you know, left them more to be raiders on the sea rather than coming out to face the Navy head on. So essentially Germany, the only course for Germany in 1939-40 onwards in the Atlantic against Britain is a sort of a strategic trade war, a blockade.
It is. You know, the way Raeder explained it to Hitler, and I think to a certain extent believed that it was true, was that the Germans could not build a navy that could defeat the British. They knew that. But almost as a shadow of the pre-World War I risk theory that the Germans had argued in 1910 up to 1914, is that we don't have to defeat the British in a battle. We only have to have a navy strong enough that when they defeat us, it will so weaken them, it will make them vulnerable to someone else so that they will be reluctant to risk their fleet against us. It's a rather convoluted argument, and some of it is self-justifying. But a shadow of that was present in 1940 as well. The way Raeder explained it is if we can send out, for example, the Bismarck or the Scharnhorst and Gneisenauer, or even the pocket battleships like the Graf Spee and the Deutschland, if we send those out into the North Atlantic, it will create such terror in Whitehall that the British will send out half their fleet to look for them. And in a way, that was true. When those individual surface raiders went to sea, and they were effectively on commerce raiding missions, the Royal Navy would send out a dozen heavy cruisers and battleships to look for them. Well, in a way, then, Raeder achieved his mission. It so dispersed the Royal Navy in pursuit of these surface raiders that it limited their ability to use that navy for more conventional purposes.
And I guess from that point of view, it's arguable to say when it's the Bismarck that sinks the Hood, it did achieve its aim of causing such consternation about sinking such an important battleship. It rattled the doors of power in Whitehall.
It did, but that was a curious phenomenon, too, because Kranke, the commander, had been told by a raider, do not expend your effort fighting the Royal Navy. Don't do that. So when he was tracked down by the Hood and the Prince of Wales, and the Hood blew up with such horrible loss of life, the Prince of Wales had also been badly damaged. But instead of following the Prince of Wales and finishing the job and annihilating that British task force, which had been an even more severe blow to Royal Navy pride and British position in the North Atlantic, he broke off action and headed south to look for merchant ships. Well, Hitler could not believe that. He was beside himself, as he often was, and chastised raiders, saying, what are you doing? Don't you The German Navy should fight to the last man and the last shell and so on and so forth. And you are cowards, and how did you let me down this way? But I think it's a reflection of the idea that the German surface navy was not intended to fight the Royal Navy warships. It was intended to be a thorn in the side, to attack surface ships and to distract the Royal Navy more than to defeat it.
When I was reading through it all, I wondered if that was one of the results, perhaps, of the of that treaty, that it made it possible for them to do that without or to put that plan in place without necessarily worrying the British on going on to an enormous building program, which I don't think they would have been able to achieve anyway. But so I wondered if that treaty sort of pushed them down that route of being a commerce raiding sort of strategy.
Not particularly. I think the economy and the requirement to make choices. I mean, every society has limits to what it can do. And for the Germans, their primary defensive position was tanks and airplanes. You know, the Panzers and the Luftwaffe. They have a border with France and a border with the Soviet Union. And yes, the British are a threat. But, the most important thing, where is the steel going to go? If we have a finite amount of steel, it's going to go to the tanks and the airplanes. So Raeder fought that, the head of the German Navy, tried to carve out for himself as much resources as he could get. And by commerce raiding, he tried to demonstrate to Hitler how effective the German Navy could be, and Hitler was just never convinced. He just thought commerce raiding could be done more effectively, more efficiently, by U-boats, certainly more cheaply by U-boats. And in 1943, he just pulled the plug and said, "That's it. I've had it with you guys. It's too expensive. I'm putting my money in the U-boats."
Last year, I talked to Robert Forsyth, who'd written a book about Operation Sea Lion. One of the things he pointed out was that he thinks that the phrase "the Battle of Britain" it would be better put as the Battle for Britain, of which the Germans possibly failed to understand the strategic use of their, the U-boat campaign, by concentrating on a tonnage strategy. So they only concentrated on how many thousands you could sink, as opposed to pinpointing certain economic goods that were vital for Britain, such as oil. I wondered what you think about that view.
The conventional explanation of the failure of the tonnage strategy is that Dönitz simply didn't have the number of U-boats he needed to make it work. And there's no way to prove one way or the other whether if he'd had the 300 U-boats he said he needed, he could have, in fact, made it work. I suspect, given the numbers, and I'm not a mathematician, but crunching those numbers and extrapolating out, it does look like he has a pretty good argument there. Now, the argument that if you select a specific bottleneck like oil, both Japan, an island nation, and Britain, an island power, were dependent on imported oil. And so if you could cut that off, if you could strategically do that, but that requires a precision that I think the U-boat arms simply did not have in 1940, and certainly not by 1943, by which time the Allies had gained the upper hand. So I think Dönitz's strategy of sinking ships, didn't matter whether they were inbound or outbound or carrying oil or carrying pit drops, it didn't matter. Sink the ships. If you sink enough ships, if you sink ships faster than the Allies can replace them, you will break that sea line across the North Atlantic, and Britain will be compelled to negotiate. That's the policy strategy match for the Germans in 1940. And I think a good argument can be made that Dönitz was right. Now, I want to back up just a minute to point out that Dönitz told Hitler he would be ready for war in 1944. Wait until 1944. Don't strike then. 1944, I'll be ready. And Hitler, who believed that the West would not react to the invasion of Poland, was impatient and in a hurry and didn't listen and started war in 1939. Had he listened to Dönitz, I think we'd have had a different outcome.
I did note down, do you think that Dönitz was possibly the only man that understood the power of the U-boat in Germany? because Raeder it seems to be too traditional of a naval man.
Right. Well, of course, Hitler was not a naval man at all. Hitler, didn't understand the sea at all. He'd been a corporal in the First War. He was a land general, a self-appointed in the Second War, and did understand elements of land war quite well, actually. We tend to say, well, he was an insane person, and to a certain extent that's absolutely true, but he was not stupid. And he did understand land war, but he did not understand naval war. And he allowed his advisors, Raeder and Dönitz, to convince him of things. And Raeder had the upper hand through the first 2 years of the war, hence the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, and the Gneisenau. But Hitler then came to see, satisfied himself, that was a dead-end strategy, and he dropped Raeder and went to Dönitz, who became not only the head of the U-boat arm, but the head of the German Navy, and, of course, when Hitler killed himself, was designated as Führer and Hitler's successor in the last days of the war.
It struck me as being quite a meteoric rise. I hadn't realised as well until I can't remember how old he was. He was quite old. He was quite young in 1940. I think he was only in his 40s. I'd always assumed he was a much older chap than that. I don't know why. It's one of those strange misconceptions.
Well, he looks old. He's kind of skeletal. If you've seen the photographs, he's very cadaver-like. His cheeks are sunken. His eyes are sunken. He's got that broad, domed forehead, and he's losing his hair. And if you've ever heard interviews of him, he had a thin, reedy little voice and talked like this. So you wouldn't necessarily think of him as a warrior, but he was a very important component of the Nazi Empire.
Well, Craig, I've been through everything on my build-up to the Second World War, and we've dipped our toe into the North Atlantic. So thank you very much. Craig has a new book, World War II at Sea, A Global History. It's probably the best naval history book on the war I've read. It is superb. I will put a link on the website. As I said at the start, Patreons, keep your eyes peeled, as there will be more of Craig and I chatting. If you're not a patron, why not jump aboard? patreon.com/WW2podcast. So that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.